Have you ever heard of the First Nations version of the Bible? It's a North American Indigenous Peoples Dynamic Equivalence translation. That's a mouthful, but that means that it takes the ancient Near Eastern message of the Bible and creatively puts it in the wording of Native American storytelling. Now, the circles I came from didn't really know First Nations translation existed at all. But I remember when I first came across it, I had that really wary mindset that we tended to have about dynamic equivalence versions that don't literally translate every word, but are trying to get at the message instead. And I felt a little awkward when I read verses like John 3:16 that said, "The Great Spirit loves this world of human beings so deeply, he gave us his Son, the only Son who fully represents him. All who trust in him and his way will not come to a bad end, but will have the life of the world to come that never fades away, full of beauty and harmony." Or Romans 3:23, "We are all the same because all of us had followed our bad hearts and broken ways." Growing up, and honestly even in Bible college, we looked down on versions like that, saying that a Bible made for a specific group of people instead of everyone in the world was inferior or untrustworthy because of inherent bias, as if the language of every translation itself is not a limiting factor. Whatever. But then I had a thought that's probably going to make some of you uncomfortable. We have talked before on the podcast, and I have an article on this on our website, about how there is no theology without adjectives. It's not just that there's black and Asian and womanist theology. There's also straight white American Protestant male theology. There is always a lens, always a bias. There is no such thing as going to the scriptures without bias. So yes, the First Nations translation is primarily from a Native American perspective and may appeal mostly to people with that heritage. But you know what? The ESV is the First Nations translation for the colonizers. It is to straight white American male theobros what the First Nations translation is to Native Americans. Now that I've pissed you all off, let's talk about why. Hey everyone, I'm Colin, the resident nerd and Bible scholar here at the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. Now, if anything, I would actually argue that there is more bias and hermeneutical hoops that the ESV jumps through than the First Nations. The First Nations gets at the idea of the underlying passages pretty well if you actually read it. It is respectful to both the original message and the modern audience. And honestly, the English Standard Version is far less trustworthy. I know. The ESV is the sacred cow of modern American evangelicalism. It is the Calvinist Bible, and those tend to be the circles where lay people interested in studying the Bible congregate. But the ESV is in the bottom half of English translations for me. But for the two of you who are still listening and aren't going to get stones to stone me, let me give you a quick caveat. I will say that if you came from King James only circles or even Textus Receptus only circles like I did, the ESV might actually be a decent version to use for a little while to help you realize that modern versions are actually pretty similar and nothing to be scared of. I needed the ESV to help me get out of King James onlyism for a while. But the ESV has its own problems. There are verses like in Romans that read, "Greet Andronicus and Junia, my kinsmen and my fellow prisoners, they are well known to the apostles." When a better reading is that the two were actually well-known apostles themselves. But the patriarchal translators of the ESV didn't want Junia, a female, to be seen as an apostle. They took a less accepted option, deviating from scholarly consensus to fit their doctrine. Or this verse, "As in all the churches of the saints, the women should keep silent in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak." That, "as in all the churches of the saints," is generally believed to be part of the previous sentence about the peace of God. But some translations, including the ESV, adopt punctuation that makes it a universal rule for women in general to be silent. There's also bias in how it's translated women instead of wives, which would honestly make more sense since husbands are mentioned in that passage instead of just men. There's a later manuscript tradition, reflected in the King James, that has it specifically as "your wives," implying that this was an instruction primarily to the Church of Corinth instead of a general prohibition. Or take this verse, "I commend to you our sister Phoebe, a servant of the church, that you may welcome her in the Lord in the way worthy of the saints." The word that the ESV chose to translate as servant is actually the word that means deacon. But our man-made attempts at understanding God's revelation, what theology is, say that women can't lead, so we correct the text. It's bad enough when a preacher does that from the pulpit, but when the very message of the Bible is changed at the translation level, that really affects how much digging people have to do to untangle the truth just when they're reading scripture. This is exactly what has happened with the Southern Baptist Convention recently, by the way, a denomination that primarily uses the ESV. So for all the people who were voting on the matter of females leading churches or just serving in churches or ministering in churches, they were affected by a translation that purposefully changed the text in order to fit their doctrines. I want to give one more disclaimer here. I don't want to erode people's trust in English versions of the Bible. Most of them are quite reliable and pretty well done, particularly those that still occasionally update. And there are plenty of places where the ESV translates more accurately than these few I gave. If in some weird hypothetical the ESV was the only version you had access to, you could still safely say you were getting the gist of the Bible. But for actual scholarship, it falls short. We would do well to read more versions like the First Nations because it's honest about its bias, and the vast difference in wording can actually help us gain a new appreciation for familiar texts. So my statement at the start that the ESV is kind of analogous to the First Nations, it was a little bit of a hook to get you interested, all right? I will be fully honest with you. That's not a great comparison, because I'd actually recommend the First Nations version and not so much the ESV. Because while the First Nations version can be jarring to people with a bubble view of Christianity, it's actually done well. What it changes in grammar and vocabulary, it clearly presents faithfully in its message. Now, I don't say this lightly without proof of motivation, but it is documented that the ESV changed certain aspects of the Bible to fit their theology. The First Nations version may mess with your theology, but that's to get the message of the Bible itself more clearly to you. And if anything should be sacrificed when it comes to translation, it should be our comfort, not the message itself.